Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and today we are honored to have Dr. Adam Clark on the podcast. Adam is an associate professor of theology at Xavier University, and he teaches courses with titles like Black Theology, Jesus and Power, Faith and Justice, and Religion and Hip Hop. That must be interesting. Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad that you could join us today. We met at the Open and Relational Theology Conference in Wyoming this last summer that Tom Ord put on. That was an amazing conference, and I heard you speak there. So how far back do you go with Tom Ord? He's an amazing person, huh?
Yeah, Tom and I, wow, someone asked me that at the conference and I couldn't remember our origin story because we've kind of been around each other, we heard of each other, but I don't remember exactly, but I think it might have been at the AAR. AAR is the American Academy of Religion. We're both
okay. Right.
So we're both professors in the academy. I think we might have met at a session there. We both knew Tripp. So Tripp was like the connecting tissue.
Tripp Fuller, right.
Yeah. Things about Tom. I thought he was actually in California. Like I thought he was at Claremont for a long time. And I since learned that he wasn't at Claremont.
No, he doesn't. I think Tripp got his PhD at Claremont, or maybe, I don't know. He went to Claremont.
Tripp did. Yeah, I thought Tom might have been on faculty there.
Right.
That wasn't the case. So
So for folks, for those of you who don't know what open and relational theology is, I'd say it can be summarized as believing that God gives and receives in relation to humanity, and that's the relational part, and then God and creatures experientially move into an open future. It also stresses issues related to God's love and presence in the universe. And I love Tom Ord's book. He wrote a book called Open and Relational Theology, Introduction to Life-Changing Ideas. And they really are life-changing, as God's overriding essence is uncontrolling love rather than, this all-powerful, big judge man in the sky with a beard kind of a thing. So anyways, let's get started by hearing some of your background. I'm curious to hear what your religious background is and how did you come to focus on what your expertise is, Black theology.
Yeah, well, my religious background, I actually grew up in a interracial Episcopal church in Syracuse, New York, right? So it's not the kind of common thing. And as a young person, I had a lot of spiritual questions and religious questions, but they weren't necessarily about race or culture specifically. It wasn't until I got to undergrad and I had a few of my mentors who were Black Baptist pastors who actually introduced like kind of historical critical studies, and they started to make the gospel real to me, meaning that before in high school, it felt like spirituality was this kind of just noble ideal that didn't have relationship to real life. And when I heard people do kind of a reading of the gospel that had an application to everyday life and social issues, kind of a sociology of the gospels.
Right.
Wow, this is really fascinating. I can relate this to kind of the contemporary American scene, and race was a part of that. So for me, it gave me a whole new vantage point to understand religion, to understand Jesus against the backdrop of his day. So we were reading people like Howard Thurman. We were reading people like Clarence Jordan and the Cotton Patch Bibles. We were reading all the kind of historical criticisms, and Jesus as a historical person in the context of empire, Roman Empire of the first century, was very like the way Black Americans were in the context of American empire at that time, the 20th century. And I saw parallels between the minority community of Jesus as a Jew in the larger Roman Empire and the minority community of Black Americans in the American Empire.
Yeah, I relate to that. Do you have any background in evangelicalism? Did that cross your path?
Yeah, well, I grew up kind of like during the 80s. So that's when like the birth of televangelists were all over the place,
Exactly.
right? So I came up, so not formally in terms of actually being a member of a church, but if you were a serious seeker during that time period, you couldn't help but hear the Jimmy Swaggart sermons and the Oral Roberts and all of these people on TV. And what was compelling about it is that it felt like they were actually teaching, right? Like it felt like I was actually learning something that I wasn't learning in my church, because the church would just do kind of a liturgy and Sunday school. But what I would hear from evangelical pastors were life applications, right? And I was like, wow, like this is really interesting. And the life applications would seem to enhance or benefit the life of believers. So for me, even though I was never actually part of that community, I felt like I was being enriched by evangelicalism, and they may have had a secret that I wasn't exposed to.
Yeah, they did.
It was kind of fascinating to me at the time.
Yeah, well, I can relate to that too, because people get into evangelicalism just for that reason. I mean, it's very appealing. It's applicable to your life. You've got you have these great questions about the mystery of life, and they seem to have all the answers. And they really know how to draw you in, and with community. And there are some good things within the movement, but like you said, there are some secrets and harmful theologies that those of us who deconstruct it from that always talk about some of the harmful theologies. But I'm really relate to what you said about learning the historical cultural context of first century Palestine and Jesus among Roman Empire, as well as Second Temple Judaism and the power that went with that. And so that's really I don't know, something that gets lost when we kind of read the Gospels from 21st or 20th century eyes. That gets lost, and it's really important to put that in context, or else we'll misunderstand what Jesus was teaching.
Absolutely. And that's part of what the liberationist thrust was about. It was trying to say there's a difference between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And what you saw with liberation theologians coming up, and which was compelling to me, was to look at Jesus's social class as a starting point for their faith identity. So Jesus wasn't a middle class person. Jesus was part of the peasant class, and he had problems that you would have with a poor peasant person, and that most of the people of Galilee he was addressing were also his same class. So to understand that, to understand the kind of marginalization of Jesus as a Jewish person from Galilee, distinct from a Jewish person from Jerusalem,
Right.
or from a Sadducee, or from even the Pharisees, right? Like, gave a different type of understanding of what the gospel is and what the gospel's priorities were on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, why don't you help us understand these terms, liberation theology and Black theology? What do they mean, and how do they apply to us today?
Yeah, well, Black theology is a form of liberation theology. Matter of fact, it's the first expression of liberation theology. Well, and maybe I should say liberation theology first.
Okay.
Liberation is just a synonym for freedom, right? It's
Mhm.
just a synonym for freedom. So when you hear liberation, think about freedom, but it's freedom from a standpoint, So what you have in the late 1960s, you have mass movements globally around the world, like anti-colonial movements in Africa and Latin America and Asia. At the same time, you have like the Black freedom movement, that is the civil rights movement and the Black power movement happening in the United States. So these are happening simultaneously. For Catholics, you have like Vatican II at the same time that's trying to respond to a world in crisis. So people of color throughout the world are resisting their colonial oppressors. And at the same time, they are looking at the official Christian churches who are taking the side of law and order instead of the side of justice.
Right, right.
They're on the wrong side, just like with King. You saw the official church on the side of segregation than with the protesters. Just like with Mandela, they are
Yeah.
on the side of the establishment. So the liberationist vision came from the idea that the gospel was about freedom, that you don't want to side with Caesar, you want to side with Jesus, right? So what happens is that they take this type of 20th century reading of the historical times and go back into the first century and look at, well, who would Jesus support? And what
Right.
is more similar to? What was Jesus' location? And he came from a location more similar to the protesters and the police and the government apparatus. So liberation theology comes from a standpoint of the human cry for freedom. The other kind of biblical paradigm comes from Exodus, right? Where you have a slave rebellion, right? With Moses, who was leading the slave rebellion against the tyrants of Egypt, right? So you have that as the definitive movement for Jewishness, right? Passover comes from this, right? Which is like almost a recreation story actually going on there, where you're recreating, you're forming a peoplehood out of that. So what you have is like people all around the world who are reading these gospels, that are reading the Bible in light of their movements of resistance and finding a lot of strength that God is siding in Exodus, not with the tyrants, but with the people who are enslaved. So therefore, God must be siding with us against these type of formal declarations of church. And they're rereading and rehearing the Christian narrative in light of that situation. So in the United States, Black theology becomes the first major expression of that, right? Through the lens of race and racial oppression, rereading what does God's movement for freedom look like in light of this suffering Black community? And that's
Right, right,
the Black theology.
right. No, it's fascinating. It's really the lens from which we view the gospel. I mean, in my experience in evangelicalism, we didn't view the gospel that way.
Mhm.
We didn't have that lens. We're mostly white. There were some blacks in some churches that I went to, or Asians and so forth, but it was mostly white, middle class, upper class people. And we didn't really think about Jesus as being a peasant.
Right.
I mean, we
Yeah.
we we kind of touched on it, but we didn't focus on it. And you really miss a lot when you realize that when you don't realize, when you don't see that dynamic going on, that Jesus was extremely poor and was on the side of the poor and the oppressed all the time. And
Mhm.
and kind of some people just put things in terms of sin and you know the supposed salvation formula and everything, and they focus on that, and they really miss what's going on in that culture, in that society, when Jesus was walking around teaching, and why he got crucified too. And then the parallels with our society. And I wanted to just dig into that a little bit. Myself, not growing up Black, not growing up in a minority. Later on, I lived in Africa for 7 years, totally opened my eyes.
Mhm.
But what's it like to face the typical human challenges that we have in life, but in a Black body, and in a minority that
Mhm.
might be, you know, discriminated against in society? What is that like?
Yeah, that's a good question. It reminds me of like Howard Thurman, who talked about, how should I face the eternal issues of the human spirit in a Black body, right? Because the Black body, and there's a couple metaphors that deal with this. Um, at first, you could talk about the Black body is invisible, right? That's where the birth of Black theology is, because the traditional official theology did not take account of Black suffering. So you have American theologians, right? And let me backtrack a bit. In Germany after the Holocaust, you couldn't be a credible German theologian without an appropriate reflection on the Holocaust, right?
Right.
It was so horrible to the
Yeah.
fabric of the German church and German society that you couldn't just bypass it, right? So what James Cone does after he gets trained, and he's the father of Black theology, right? He looks at all the theological literature and all the great American theologians and doesn't find them grappling at all with slavery or Native American genocide,
Right.
right? He's like, how could you be a Christian who's sensitive to sin and suffering and not even wrestle with this horrible evil that didn't just last for 3 years, 6 years, a decade, but for hundreds of years in this country?
Yes.
You have to reckon with that.
Right.
Church has a higher calling to actually deal with evil. And this is an explicit, visible evil in this country. And the church is not wrestling, it's invisible. So to be in a Black body is to be disposable, to be invisible to the dominant culture. And what Black theology is spotlights and highlights, it puts attention onto this so that the Christian church can't miss it. It has to wrestle with it in order to regain its integrity.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's a matter of perspective. You know, we the Black community experiences life differently. The minority or the oppressed or the discriminated experience life differently, and oftentimes other people who aren't particularly oppressed or anything, who have more privilege, they just don't even recognize it. Right? Can you give examples of that?
Yeah, um, the most recent probably broad is like the kind of resurgence of Black Lives Matter with George
Hmm.
Floyd, right?
Yeah.
You have a kind of racial reckoning in this country after that, where you have, let's say, the type of understanding of the Confederate flag, right?
Hmm.
Is
Hmm.
it heritage or is it hate?
You're right. Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Like that type of like grappling with this type of symbol of our culture. And then you have the breakdown of this type of people like um, attacking Confederate monuments throughout the South, right?
Hmm.
Because what happens is that monuments are testaments to the type of memory we want to have of our country, right? Like, it's amazing. Like, what's happening in the South is that you have like a whole bunch of white Christians who say that's our heritage, but they don't see these people as traitors to the United States.
Right. Right.
Right? You don't see
Yeah.
these people as enslavers. You see this as part of your heritage and your way of life. So that is about trying the politics of memory. How are you remembering these people? And these memory of these people who did so much evil has become sanitized into the white Christian evangelical imagination that they become these type of heroic things that continue to reproduce certain types of theological and political frameworks onto it that lead to more division and to me America and the church to be less inclusive instead of more inclusive, to be less compassionate rather than being more compassionate, to be less loving, right? So that's one thing in terms of the of a type of reckoning of race that's happened at kind of a wide scale in the last like decade, right? And I think that's probably the major point to look at is that the politics of how that looks, and that informs how people look at things like Colin Kaepernick, right? How do you read Colin Kaepernick? Is he being disrespectful to the country?
Yeah.
Or
Right.
is he trying to call the country to a higher level of
Right.
integrity?
Is he calling the country to a more perfect union?
Right, right, right.
Right. Right. No, that's fascinating. And the without without the experiences that people have who face injustice, there's a blind spot there that people just don't see. And like you said, it's also in the way we read history too. All right. So if you had you have injustice in the world, and Christians will ask the question, okay, we've got bad things going on here. What went wrong? And largely Christian, most Christian streams often say, well, the answer is sin went wrong. Okay. And so the question is, what about more of a largely, instead of a largely white Christian community, a largely black Christian community? How would they answer that question? What went wrong in the world?
Yeah, sin is just not a wrong answer. It's just inadequate in terms of,
Right,
because when most people say sin, they mean personal sin, like
right,
the do's and the don'ts. Don't drink, smoke, have sex outside of marriage. Like they're talking about very small little issues of personal conduct, not structural sin,
right,
like racism, sexism, all these other types of like class exploitation, environmental degradation. Like that's social sin. But it another way to kind of frame it is that the gospel is not just about sin, it's sin and suffering.
mm-hmm.
Right?
Good,
So the idea of the gospel of a God who wants to abolish or eliminate suffering of the poor, and it's the address to the suffering of the poor. Sin is one dimension of the suffering, and there's multiples, but suffering might be a more adequate, right? So why do we suffer, right? So we can look at least like in the Black community, the idea of suffering is because of white supremacy, is because the primary and most visible source of Black suffering. So therefore, just like philosophy is an address to truth, theology is an address to suffering. And it asks the question about how can the Christian faith adequately address the sufferings of the poor, right? And it tries to construct theology in a way that is effective in addressing that.
right, right. Yeah, that's an excellent distinction. Sin is just not adequate to explain what's wrong with the world. It's the impact of sin, which is people suffering under oppressive systems, etc., and mindsets, and etc. It
Mhm.
includes
Absolutely.
individual sin, but it's much more than that, much more broad.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned white supremacy. Where you wonder, where does that come from? I mean, like I think one interesting question would be, um, what is the doctrine of discovery that we've seen in our history, in Western civilization? We had the era of time when we became colonial powers and European nations, and there was this thing called the doctrine of discovery,
Mhm.
and that kind of, in my mind, drives white supremacy, and it's still hanging around with us. What is that, and how does that work?
Yeah, well, the Doctrine of Discovery it's actually a series of papal bulls in the 15th century that basically the Pope it's much more Catholic than Protestant, but the
Right.
Doctrine of Discovery came from the Catholic Church. It was a papal bull that gave permission to Christians to invade the lands of infidels or non-Christians, right? So you have white Christian West who are starting to kind of explore the world around it, going to Africa, going to Asia, going to Latin America, finding groups of people. And the question is, you know, do I have sanction from my church, right, to steal the land, right? That's really the thing, and they find a religious justification to do that through the papal bulls. It's like these are
Right.
they're non-Christians, so
They're
therefore,
infidels, you said. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
infidels, right? The land belongs to the Christian God, not
Right.
to their tribal gods, right?
Right.
So it gives this type of it's an imperial document that gives religious sanction to European explorers to violently conquer and to eliminate indigenous populations throughout the world, and it had tremendous damage.
Yeah, and I think it impacted the Protestant missions as well as the Catholic missions,
Oh,
because
yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
even though it didn't come from Protestantism, they certainly wrote on that same mentality.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm from New England, and studying a little bit of history in New England, with the Puritans and everything coming in and having that same attitude of, the land that we're gonna make a city on a hill here with a
Mhm.
divine, mandate to reach the world with the gospel, and we're the we're superior. I mean, there's a superiority, right, than these infidel pagan natives here that are uncivilized, etc. And then you have guys like I don't know if you're familiar with Roger Williams, but Roger Williams was the one who settled and founded Rhode Island, but he left the Puritans because he said, "You guys are crazy, man." And he started talking about there should be a separation between religion and the state, church and state, and we need to be more Christ-like with the native population. And he actually
Mm.
went and bought the land from natives. He didn't steal the land; he actually paid for the land. What a concept! So
Right.
he was one of the minority people who did it
Mhm.
more a more humane way, but the overwhelming majority didn't do it that way. So yeah,
Yeah.
then you had that whole mentality just keeps, I mean, in my mind, it's the mentality that it's taken centuries to get over, and we're still not over it completely.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned,
It goes back to Constantine, actually.
yeah, well,
As soon
yeah, it goes back to Constantine. Exactly.
mhm,
Right.
as it became an imperial religion, you have these type of justifications of people who are against people who are non-Christian. And this is when liberation theology says that we have to frame the gospel, we have to frame faith not as faith versus the non-believer, but faith versus the dehumanized or the non-person, right? Like the
Right.
the faith should be addressed to people who have been dehumanized, not to people who don't believe like you do. So with
Right.
the problem with evangelicalism in this and the doctrine of discovery is that they think that the primary mission of faith is to convert, right, in terms of a cognitive belief system, the unfaithful, instead of to rehumanize people who've been dehumanized.
That's a excellent point. Right. Yeah. It's all about doctrine and, getting a ticket to heaven, believing the right things, and being on the right side, rather than actually, well, an egalitarian way of looking at the world and saying, "Hey, everyone is the same. We need to make sure that we're treating everyone humanely and loving our neighbor and actually following the love ethic of Christ."
Yeah, when you see a homeless person on the side of the road, your first thing is it, do you believe in Jesus as Lord and Savior?
Yeah, right, right.
You feed the person.
No, yeah, right, right. But I mean, that's what evangelicals teach. They say, "Oh, people are in sin, and if they're poor, if they're struggling, and they haven't accepted Christ, then we got to get them to accept Christ, or nothing will work."
Yeah, absolutely. And
Right,
that's the critique and saying that that is a misapprehension of the faith. And that's not what Jesus would do, right? Like Jesus
right,
didn't do that, right?
exactly,
In terms of that, he doesn't ask you for your credentials before you get healed.
right, yeah.
Mhm.
So you mentioned James Cone. I'm not really familiar with him. I just noticed at the conference everyone was talking about him.
Okay, okay.
And then I
Yeah.
looked up, he's got a couple books that I noticed that were really incredible titles. He had
Mhm,
a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree,
mhm.
and The God of the Oppressed. Tell us a little bit about James Cone and his ideas. When did he live? And what is he still alive, or is he passed away? And what?
He passed in 2018, but James
Oh,
Cone
okay.
is seen as the father of Black theology. He's the one
Okay.
who came up, the academic father, I should say.
Yeah.
It was a church movement that started 1966, like right after the Black Power movement. But he's the one who wrote the first books that made it an academic discipline. So he started out with a Black theology of liberation. Well, Black theology, Black power, then Black theology of liberation, then God of the oppressed. And he starts to develop this whole literature to help us think about liberation theology or Christian theology from the standpoint of Black suffering. Um, so he worked at Union Theological Seminary for almost 50 years. I mean, he's been there in New York City for such a long time, and he produced a literature and taught thousands of students and produced many doctoral students to give this a type of intellectual and disciplinary perspective that now is in most type of progressive seminaries throughout the country.
Right. Okay.
He's a seminal religious thinker.
Right. Okay. No, it sounds fascinating. I think I want to read one of his books and see what everyone's talking about. But those are the kinds of things that, growing up in predominantly white evangelicalism, you never hear of these types of ideas, notions of authors. Um, you never. It just kind of blew me away. Like no one ever honored Martin Luther King, for example, in the civil rights movement. I mean, it's just nothing. It wasn't, Billy Graham would say, "Well, you got to get someone saved first, and then we'll solve racism." Well,
I'll tell you a funny story. I went to Union Theological Seminary, and James Coble was my professor.
Oh, nice.
In the summer, they rented out a lot of space to people, and sometimes they were evangelical groups who just were in New York City and they just needed a place to stay because most of the students were off campus. But I was staying there the summer. So I remember there were a group of white evangelicals like in our kind of in our common space, I should say. And they were, I guess, having Bible study and reading certain types of literature. And I came into the room and they said, "Who's your favorite Christian author?"
Right.
And I said, "James Cone."
Oh, yeah.
Dolores Williams. Wow, I've never heard of them before.
Who the hell is that? Right.
Exactly. Said,
no, that's typical.
Time. And I tell
right.
You, like, he's totally not on the list. And they mentioned probably, Robert Schuller or
James Dobson or something, right.
Something like that. Something like that. Something that came from that. And they were like, James, I gotta look for him up. I don't really
right.
No, it's kind of interesting. It was just like we talked past each other. Like
no, that's true. You talk past each other, you're in different worlds. I mean, for me, I thought I was on the cutting edge because I liked Francis Schaeffer, and I like still like a lot of the things that he wrote about, but to me, he was still caught in that theology, that a lot of harmful evangelical theology. Anyways, we're going to take a quick break here. Have an ad here, and we'll be back shortly with Adam Clark. Okay, so that's where the ad goes in. So,
gotcha.
Okay, we're back with Adam Clark here, and Adam, we're having a great conversation. My next question is, this is really kind of blows me away when you look at the whole line or drama of Christian history. Okay, you see certain milestones in Christian history. For example, you see, like you mentioned, the Emperor Constantine. He became a Christian, and then later on, another emperor made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and we no longer have this separation of church and state. And all of a sudden, Christianity was the official religion. You had to have the right doctrines. They started to chase the heretics because they didn't have the right doctrines. People decided what books would be in the Bible, all this stuff. And then we had these, what we call ecumenical councils, where you have, okay, we're going to decide what the official creed should be, what the official view of the Bible and official view of all these things are. You had all this, and then you had the Reformation, where the Protestants said, hey, there's a lot of corruption in the Catholic Church. and they rightly identified that corruption, and they tried to make changes. But even after all that, right, ecumenical councils, the Protestant Reformation, right, why didn't Western Christianity stop slavery, apartheid, oppressive
Mhm.
systems? Those things kept cropping up, and they weren't from these pagans. They were from systems that were perpetuated by some people who claim to be Christian. So
Mhm.
my question is, in your view, why is that? Why is there, why with all this reform and thought about doctrine and what the real Christian faith should be, why didn't Christian communities, societies stop slavery and apartheid and oppression way before some of them were stopped?
Well, it's because most of Western Christianity saw the problem as faith versus reason. So most of these councils came in the context of either the Greco-Roman Empire early on, and they're trying to justify rationally how they could actually make account of their faith in the secular or non-Christian world. For example, the earliest Christian councils were about the divinity of Christ.
Right, right.
How can we make sense that we say that God is Father, and God is Son, and God is Holy Spirit? Like, how does
Yeah.
that? Because you had Christianity was a pluralistic phenomenon. I mean, people didn't really profess the same thing. They had a central importance to Jesus, but Jesus, for some people, was seen as um, the human Son of God. For some people, Jesus was seen as maybe just like kind of this illusion of suffering. For other people, Jesus was seen as God on earth and not human at all. So there were a lot of different types of perspective, and they all saw themselves as faithful Christians, right? And even their behavior, you might not have known a bit difference because they're all talking about Jesus with a much admiration. But as empires like to do, everybody had to believe and actually affirm the same thing.
Right, right.
It was about how can we give a rational account of our faith, right?
And
And
all agree on it.
and to agree on it, right? Now,
Right.
here's the switch that happens with the liberationist movement in the 20th century. Instead of talking about faith being accountable to reason, what if we thought that faith had to be accountable to justice, right?
Right.
Especially the justice of the most poor and suffering in the world? What
Hmm.
if the credibility of Christian faith rested on how effective it was at addressing the suffering of the poor and disenfranchised
Hmm.
instead of its rational credibility in terms of its intellectual structure?
Right.
Right. And that's the shift because all of these councils were about trying to make claims seem rationally credible, but not credible in relationship to the poor.
No, that makes perfect sense. Right. So, yeah, and it's a paradigm shift. It's just a total paradigm shift. Just like instead of focusing on, you should focus on justice rather than what's the right doctrine. Now, when I was studying history, um, I got into this, like, okay, there's all these different streams and there's all these claims of heresy because you're not believing the right thing. And one of the things was Christology, right? How do you, like you said, how do you define, God and Jesus and being God and divine, and combined with being human? And they would have all these arguments about the most nitpicky things. And even today, your typical fundamentalist believer might go back and look at what they were arguing about and go, that's crazy. You're getting so nitpicky about it that the Nestorians were called heretics because they had a slightly different way of thinking than the Orthodox way, right? Things like that. They were just getting so hung up on all these things.
Well,
It's just,
there's a category that a lot of church historians use. It's called the narcissism of small differences.
oh, there we go.
The narcissism of small differences. There were infinitesimal differences that you, as an outsider, might not detect between certain types of Christian communities in the early
Right.
centuries. That for them were so stark, it could lead to violence and war.
Right.
Right? In terms of just like little things over liturgy, or even things about like what the mass is. It real presence, or is, I mean, these are later conversations, but is it real presence? Is it symbolic presence? I mean, all of these type of things like had tremendous implications. The Donatist controversies with Augustines, like all of these things had like life transforming, life altering types of impact on how you decided those things. So so for outsiders, they looked at like, you're all Christian, you all believe that Jesus has a central role in your spirit, in your faith journey. But internally to them, there was such traumatic fallout between those, like the slightest view is that what we're looking at when we look at church history, we're looking at the historic winners. But
Yes. Right.
but we don't necessarily in the 21st century have to abide by the decisions that were made a century ago. We can look at some of those ones who didn't really win and say they might have had something in life enhancing to say to us today about Jesus and our faith.
Oh yeah, and that's what I've discovered. I studied the Nestorians, and I was really impressed with their community, but they were one of the losers. They they pretty much
Gospel of Thomas by a lot of Christians, right? They like
that?
the Gospel of Thomas, like that got kind of left out of the canon. Like people are going back and looking at things and find like there's some really interesting stuff that like feels like liberating to me through that.
Yeah. So I mean, I still can't wrap my head around this. But why is that? Why is doctrines and orthodox beliefs? Why does that kind of hinder people from actually seeing what you and I might call the core of the gospel is that love your neighbor, love your enemies, and especially care for the marginalized and the oppressed. That's what Jesus was doing and demonstrating and teaching us to do.
Well, this is a problem almost distinctive to any type of monotheism. Part of the problem is like a narrow monotheism where you believe this is not just a difference of opinion. This is offensive to God to see it differently, right?
Yeah.
It's metaphysic. And it's this type of, so you don't have these problems in religiously plural cultures and like polytheistic cultures. Like, because they could say, if you're in a polytheistic world, you could say, hey, your God does this and my God does this. We can still get together and do certain things.
Right.
Monotheistic culture, and there's only one God and everything is false outside of that.
Yeah, right.
It leads to not just difference, but about enemy difference, right? Like there are people who are offensive to God, not just differing from you. So that was part of the problem with Christianity and Islam as well. Like why they became such violent religions is because they have this idea of monotheism that the smallest type of difference is to actually offend God and God's church or mosque and that type of thing. So they've led to some of the most violent outcomes in the world today.
No, that makes sense. But one of the things that I discovered in my study of Christian history is that in the beginning, when they were starting to identify people as heretics, let's say you're not believing the right thing. In the very beginning, of course, if you go back far enough, they didn't really think about this. They were just focused on community and helping the poor. And in the first century, I think that there were some real genuine communities around Jesus who were really living out the gospel, right? And then this thing we're talking about came up. This is more important to get your doctrine right, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, it was like, okay, it's important to get our doctrine right, but it's okay if this guy's a heretic, he can still come to my church. It's okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it just morphed and evolved, and finally was no, you can't come to my church. You are a heretic. And then it evolved after that. Not only that, you should be executed if you don't recant. I mean, just crazy stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it didn't happen overnight. It was kind of an evolution.
Mm.
That mentality is still here today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And heresies were used for people who are inside the faith. Demonic were used for people outside the faith.
Right. Right. And so, right. Then again, right. Yeah, exactly. So it's crazy. The Roman state persecuted Christians, and then Roman state became Christians, and they still persecuted Christians. They just called it heresy instead of something else, right?
Well, it became the religious other soon morphed in Western Christianity to the racialized other, right?
Yeah, right,
It became that, where the racialized
right,
other was seen as that. So what's happened within Christianity is that the problem of otherness and non-personhood has been like almost intrinsic to the thought system. So the thought of like how you, I mean, and we're quickly becoming a community, the world community, I should say, where we're realizing like that difference is so ubiquitous in different forms, sexual differences, racial differences, gender differences, everything, that the problem about who is your neighbor is really getting much more complicated, that we have to talk about Christianity as a religion of neighborliness now, and how you deal with the neighbor instead of otherliness, right? So if Christianity is going to survive as a positive good, it needs to refocus its emphasis on neighborliness. And neighborliness in the early Hebrew Bible was just your fellow Hebrew. And then it grew to try to talk about not just as a geographic proximity, but as a moral category. But now we're even seeing people that neighborliness may include non-human neighbors like creation and the mountains and
right.
species, right? So we need to really think about their evolving standards of dignity. As we mature as a species, our Christianity must evolve and grow with us as well.
Right.
What theologians do, they're trying to reinterpret it in light of contemporary moral circumstances.
Right. So, a lot of people. Let's talk about racism as a concept. A lot of people they kind of define racism as something like, someone who has personal hatred for Black people or certain people of color or certain race of people. Why is it more than that? Why is that such a limited definition?
Yeah, like most people in America, when someone says someone's a racist, they're talking about people who have personal animus toward Blacks or non-white people, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so that's why they say, "Well, I don't know your heart," right?
Right.
Right? I can't read your heart. And racism is much more systematic and structural, and that even if people don't have evil intent, they can participate in racist practices that have negative impact on the lives of Black people. So racism is much
Some
more,
examples.
excuse me.
Give us some examples.
Oh, like for example, let me say this way. Racism as most dangerous is something that's in the imagination. It's like how you come to know the world. And this is what I see the most of. Like when you read the Bible, let's say this. Let me talk about it as this is not necessarily racism, but this is like a way of trying to talk about whiteness as a way of knowing, right? That reinforces racial hierarchies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're reading the Bible and you're reading, and you're imaging Moses. Moses is an Egyptian, but do you know Moses is African?
Yeah.
Have you ever just seen Moses depicted as African, even though it says all over the Bible that he's African?
Yeah.
Do you ever think of Exodus as an African story?
Right.
Right? Like those type of omissions, right, reinforce the idea that Africa never gave anything to humankind, right? And
Mm-hmm.
reinforce the existing racial hierarchies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what when we talk about racism and white supremacy, we're not talking about something to condemn, you know, there's something called fundamental racism, where fundamental racism where you be black people are different species, like and that's like rare. You have people who are make Klanners and Nazis and that type of thing, but that's not the most dangerous form of racism because most white people disagree with those people too. But the
Right.
most dangerous form of racism that black theologians are critique are the unconscious racisms and racial practices that white people with well intentions practice every single day and do it unknowingly, but it has tremendous amounts of suffering on the other side of that. And I'm just saying, like, the fact that, that so much, that most whites aren't even in conversation with blacks. The idea of like when you see like black studies or critical race theory being eliminated from college curriculums and the 1619 project and all of this type of and the type of demonization of DEI and diversity programs and the kind of
Mm-hmm.
electoral season and that type of thing. Those are the type of thing. It's like this type of erasure to talk about. There's a book called Racism Without Racists, and he has this term called colorblind racism.
Mm-hmm.
If you make everything race neutral, that you reinforce the very existing racial hierarchies. So in order to correct for something that's been here from before you were born, right, you have to be intentional about doing that. And again, I'll use the German example. In Germany, no one would ever think about not actually teaching about the Holocaust in German schools.
Right. Right.
No one would ever think, or no one would ever be offended if you tried to give some type of financial compensation to the victims of the German Holocaust who lost treasure, who lost people, who
Mm-hmm.
lost culture in that. But the same type of thing doesn't hold. Matter of fact, most white Americans are more sympathetic to what happened in Germany than they are to what happened to Black and Native people in their own country.
Yeah, that's interesting. Right.
Yeah. And that's what Black theologian tries to call out and saying that you are talking so much about what happens, like Catholics talk about what happens in Latin America, like Latin American poverty. White Christians talk about much more what happened in Germany, but no, you don't have this type of collective suffering on what your ancestors and the institutions they perpetuate happened right here in the United States.
Right. No, that's fascinating. So there's a lot to unpack in all this stuff that we're talking about, and I think one of the things that comes out is that right thinking is very important, because if you don't kind of see the world in in a more accurate way, in a way that has empathy with the people who are suffering, etc., then your actions are not gonna be the best actions. I think you say something about that. Why is right thinking about the world important?
Yeah. Well, when after the period of enslavement, the Black church, uh, you have these like building of Black churches all throughout the South and the United States because Black people could own their own churches. So when you ask most Blacks at the time, they would say, what's the difference between the Black church and the white church? The
Yeah,
response was, look, we have the same faith, but we practice it differently,
yeah,
right? And what James Cone said is said, look, how could they practice segregation or practice wrong but think right? There's something wrong about that. If you
right,
participate in lynchings and Jim Crow, but you're saying they have the right thinking about the faith, he says, I'm going to challenge that and say maybe they are interpreting the faith right if they can practice things that are so evil and wrong.
right,
So the idea of that is that your practice, that people who are practicing the faith in very demonic and evil ways shouldn't be trusted as credible on their interpretation of the faith,
yeah. That makes sense.
right? So we have
So
Now, it's easier to see that if you heard a theologian was a child abuser or doing sexual abuse, you would say, I don't know if I trust their theology because they're
Yeah.
sexually abusing somebody, right?
Right. Right.
We don't do the same thing around race, and that's what he's saying.
Yeah, I see. So we're running out of time, but let's just talk briefly about what can change. How can people who purport to follow Jesus or call themselves Christians make the gospel relevant to oppressed people and what's going on in our societies today?
Yeah, James Cone has his article called "Theology's Greatest Sin," and he talks about how racism is the original sin of the United States. And in that, he talks about how you could have a anti-racist that any white person, wherever they are, the church and society, in the educational system, can have an anti-racist posture to it. It's not enough to just not be non-racist, but to be anti-racist is a
Right.
much more justice-orientated thing, and that looks differently depending on where you're situated. So when I talk to local ministers, white ministers in my community here, I say, look, even if you just platform Black religious thinkers, if you use your liturgy to actually engage Martin Luther King or the work of James Cone or Howard Thurman or something like that, like in your liturgy. Not everybody's called to be a protester, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can do this even if you change your representation in your books or in your stained glass windows to make them more historically accurate. That in and of itself is a move forward, and that's part of an anti-racist kind of Christian orientation. But there are many ways to start. It doesn't always have to be about protesting City Hall. It could be about bringing Black people into the conversation about things that matter most.
Right, right. Yeah, a friend of mine, Dan Henderson, just wrote a book. I had a podcast about it. The subtitle was "The White Man's Guide to Anti-Racism." Really opened up my eyes to see how there is a difference between, okay, I'm just, I'm against racism, but are people proactively anti-racism in what they do? And one of the things that I see is promoting restorative justice in our criminal justice system so that it's more equitable, and also having that mindset of not, rather than taking retributive action against people, but having a restorative way of correcting society in areas. Can you talk about that a little bit? Restorative justice.
Yeah, restorative justice is a concept that probably got most popularized with South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation Committees, where you have this idea that when you have great breaches in society, one way to actually put people together is to make people whole, is to not focus on retribution, but to focus on restoration. And what does that look like? And you can, and normally, at least in the United States, they do that with nonviolent offenses. It's hard if like someone goes and kills your family member to be like, most people want that person in jail, right? Like in terms
right.
It's very difficult for that. Although some people, go farther than that. But I'll just talk about the normative use of restorative justice, because we do that at our university a lot of times. If a student does something that violates another student, instead of sending them to the police, right? They'll bring the parties together and try to creatively think about what makes this person whole. First, there's an acknowledgement that you've done wrong or you violated the person. Then there's contrition, and there's a different steps on what you have to take. But the end of it is that instead of the focus beyond punishing the offender participates in actually making amends to the person, the offendee, of of what their violation was, and that's the end product, and it's done in a number of different ways.
No, that's a great example. Right. Yeah. And when we don't do that and we focus on retribution, that just, to me, that perpetuates the inequalities in our society too, because there's a mindset that the solution, oh, we've got high crime in the city or whatever, and oftentimes Black communities are scapegoated, or immigrants are scapegoated as the ones that are the cause of all this crime and et cetera, when the statistics might say otherwise. But there also is there's a kind of a mentality of retribution, tough on crime, right? Prison sentences, and that just perpetuates the whole cycle, but restorative justice actually goes to the root of the problem and restores society. And it's a big difference.
No, you're right. I mean, the Black community, if you see drug activity like, for example, drugs happen at college campuses, it's seen as a mental health problem. Let's get therapy. Let's this person. It's a public health problem, but a drug problem in the Black community is seen as a crime problem.
Yes, right.
Yep. So that gets back to your point earlier about Black bodies, right? Instead of, Du Bois, in his Souls of Black Folk, one of his opening issues was that, how does it feel to be a problem people? Not a people with problems, but a problem people. And Black people, in the eyes of many whites, are problem people. They're not just people with problems. So therefore, things that might be health issues are criminalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I work at a private school, and you might see people with drug addiction problems and all these other type of things. No one would ever think of throwing that person away. They would say, Johnny, we're going to get you help. We're going to get you the best therapist. We're going to get you a resource. We're going to take you to rehab, all of that. They're not going to sit down, lock you up, throw away the key like they do to Black kids.
Right.
That's the major thing about the assumption of Black bodies, that Black bodies are seen as less intelligent, less beautiful, and more inclined to criminality.
Right.
That's part of the racial assumptions about Blackness that is at the root of how we approach it. So restorative justice and other approaches, especially when you're dealing with Black bodies, says that we need to make these people whole, that if there's someone who's acting out of line, let's reimagine public safety, right? It's not that safety is not a legitimate concern, is that sometimes people need psychiatric counseling. Sometimes it's not that their Blackness made them more prone to or violent. It's like there is a plethora of reasons, human reasons, why they're knocked out, and that if we do that for very affluent kids in upper class suburban communities, we ought to do it for Black kids without resources as well.
Yeah, excellent example. Yeah. So, Adam, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, and also one other question: where can people go if they want to learn more about you and your work and us and Black theology in general?
Yeah. Well, I'm at Xavier University, Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm also, we're Facebook friends. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and X. I can't remember all my names, but Adam Clark.
All right, we'll put social in the show notes, some of your social media.
Right. I'm working out a book on Black theology, but in the meantime, I would recommend James Cone's, all of his work. I would say if you want to start, maybe God of the Oppressor is a good place to start.
Okay. All right. And we'll put that in the show notes too. Okay. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Great. Thank you so much, Adam. And folks, until next time on the Spiritual Brew Pub, enjoy responsibly.